On the evening when the Harrington sisters were measured by society as one might appraise porcelain, the ballroom of Ashcombe House blazed with borrowed stars. Chandeliers scattered light like judgment, catching on silk, jewels, and expectant smiles. Music swelled, a practiced optimism, while whispers traveled faster than the violins. It was agreed, before a single step was taken, that beauty would be rewarded, and obscurity would be seated near the wall. Arabella Harrington stood at the center of that agreement. She wore ivory satin that clung to admiration, her curls arranged with studied care, her laughter bright enough to invite approval. Mothers angled daughters toward her glow. Fathers nodded as though an investment had ripened. Every compliment seemed to polish her favor, until she reflected back exactly what the room desired to see. Her youngest sister, Eleanor, occupied the margin of the scene. She had been dressed by economy and instruction, dove-gray muslin, modest neckline, gloves repaired with patience rather than taste. She sat where the candles thinned, hands folded, posture precise, as though invisibility were a discipline she had mastered. When eyes passed over her, they did not linger long enough to wound openly, which was its own refinement of cruelty. Their mother moved between them with careful arithmetic, counting glances, weighing futures. To Arabella she offered smiles and murmured assurances. To Eleanor she gave reminders. "Do not linger," she said softly, as if kindness lay in efficiency. "Do not trouble anyone." Eleanor inclined her head, accepting the terms of her presence like a debt inherited. The Duke of Ravenshollow arrived late, as men of consequence often do, allowing anticipation to soften into relief. Conversation shifted, recalibrating itself around his entrance. He was not young, but command had settled into him attractively, carving lines that spoke of decisions made and kept. His coat was dark, his expression measured, his reputation a quiet thunder. He had come, everyone believed, to choose. Eleanor watched the room lean toward him as wheat bends toward weather. She had seen men like him before, distant and complete, their lives already written in ink that others must read carefully. She did not expect his gaze to find her, and when it brushed past without recognition, she felt only the familiar ache of accuracy. This was how the world worked, and she had learned its grammar early. Introductions followed. Arabella was presented with ceremonial delight, her name carried on a sigh. The Duke bowed, his attention precise, approving. Their first exchange was faultless, a duet of manners that drew murmurs of satisfaction. Eleanor listened from her chair, each word a stitch sewing the evening toward its conclusion. Then came a moment that fixed itself in memory like a bruise beneath silk. A gentleman, careless with wine and confidence, laughed too loudly and remarked that the family was fortunate to possess one jewel fit for display. The comment floated, unchallenged, before settling. Arabella smiled, uncertain whether to accept or refuse the praise. Eleanor felt heat rise, not to her face, but behind her eyes, where humiliation becomes endurance. No one corrected the man. Silence, that most polite accomplice, did the work instead. Eleanor lowered her gaze, schooling her breath. She would not weep. She would not flee. Dignity, she had learned, was a posture maintained even when unseen. The Duke heard the remark. His expression did not change, yet something in him stilled, as though a note had gone faintly wrong. He glanced again toward the sisters, not lingering, merely noting. In that instant, Eleanor sensed the dangerous possibility of being perceived, and the fear of it followed swiftly after. The music resumed, louder, determined to smooth the moment away. Arabella was claimed for a dance, then another. Eleanor remained seated, the wall cool at her back, the room moving without her. Still, she felt the weight of that brief attention like a question unfinished. From her place, Eleanor observed the rituals that governed belonging. Fans lifted and fell like signals, compliments were traded as currency, and laughter served as proof of worth. She knew these motions well, having studied them as one studies a language never spoken aloud. Each courtesy excluded her by its perfection. Yet within her chest stirred a quiet resistance, not hope, but an insistence on remaining whole. She recalled earlier evenings, smaller rooms, the same arithmetic repeated until it felt inevitable. Tonight differed only in scale. The cruelty was grander, the approval louder. Somewhere beyond the windows, carriages waited in obedient rows, ready to carry destinies home. Eleanor imagined herself stepping into the night alone, the air cool and honest, unadorned by judgment. The thought steadied her. If she must endure, she would do so awake, memorizing every slight, every kindness withheld, as one might gather evidence against a future that pretended not to see her. Near the musicians, a pair of matrons whispered with deliberate softness, their eyes flicking toward the sisters like needles testing fabric. Eleanor caught fragments, enough to know her name had been weighed and found wanting. She felt no surprise, only the dull acknowledgement of pattern. Across the floor, Arabella turned, radiant in motion, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. Something unkind passed between them, quick and practiced, before affection reclaimed its mask. Eleanor understood then that praise could wound as surely as scorn, that comparison was the instrument by which love was rationed. She straightened, smoothing her gloves, and resolved to leave before midnight claimed her composure. The choice felt small, yet it was hers, and that possession mattered. Still, the room held her, and she remained, compelled by a thread she could neither see nor sever. Yet, in waiting, learned something about herself. As the evening deepened, the Duke stood beside Arabella, society already rehearsing their future. Yet across the space between light and shadow, Eleanor lifted her eyes, and for the first time, his gaze met hers without confusion, as if he had chosen to look, and the choice itself unsettled them both. Morning light altered Ashcombe House, stripping it of last night's splendor and revealing the quieter hierarchies beneath. Flowers drooped in vases like tired courtiers, and the echo of music lingered only as a faint ache. Yet the consequences of the evening had already taken shape, moving through corridors and correspondence with practiced efficiency. By noon, it was understood that the Duke of Ravensaloe had admired Arabella Harrington exceedingly. Cards arrived with his seal, heavy and deliberate, delivered as though by intention rather than courtesy. The household gathered to witness each one opened, its contents praised aloud. Arabella received them with composed delight, her triumph measured, her smile trained not to appear greedy. Eleanor stood nearby, summoned not by invitation but by expectation, her presence required to confirm the contrast. The first token was modest, a bouquet arranged with restraint, white blooms chosen for their purity rather than their scent. Arabella accepted them as evidence, lifting them to her face as though fragrance and fortune were inseparable. Eleanor noticed the careful selection, the absence of excess, and wondered what it revealed of the giver. She wondered too much, and so scolded herself into silence. The second token arrived 3 days later, accompanied by murmurs that grew teeth. It was a book, leather-bound and old, its pages softened by years of handling. A note lay inside, brief and exacting, written in a hand that valued clarity over flourish. It was addressed not to Arabella, but to Miss Harrington, and delivered in error to the morning room where Eleanor sat alone. She recognized the volume at once. It was a collection of essays on duty and conscience, a work her father had once prized, a subject she had been accused of favoring to excess. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she traced the inscription, unsure whether to return it unopened or absorb the quiet acknowledgment it implied. Before she could decide, footsteps approached, and the moment narrowed into danger. Arabella entered, radiant with expectation, her gaze falling first on the book, then on Eleanor's face. Surprise sharpened into something colder. She took the volume without asking, her laughter quick and dismissive. "He must have mistaken us," she said lightly, as though correcting a servant. "These are hardly my tastes." The words landed, gentle and exact, their cruelty concealed by reason. That afternoon, the Duke called. His presence reorganized the house, drawing attention as fire draws breath. He spoke with Arabella in the parlor, their voices measured, their pauses meaningful. Eleanor passed the doorway once, then twice, unnoticed, carrying tea she had not been asked to prepare. When she glanced up, she met the Duke's eyes briefly, and in them flickered a question that went unanswered. Rumor, meanwhile, found its nourishment. Someone had seen Eleanor reading the book in the garden. Someone else had observed the Duke walking past her without acknowledgement, his expression unreadable. By evening, the whispers had grown clever, suggesting ambition where there was only attention, impropriety where there had been none. Eleanor sensed the shift before it spoke her name aloud. The scandal arrived dressed as concern. A distant cousin remarked upon appearances, her voice sweetened with warning. Their mother's gaze sharpened, calculating damage. Arabella grew quieter, her smiles thinner, her affection edged with possession. Eleanor felt herself receding, as though the house was subtly rearranging to remove her from view. When the Duke sent for the book, confusion followed. The message was formal, the request precise. Arabella returned the volume with practiced grace, her explanation rehearsed. Eleanor was not mentioned, except as a misunderstanding corrected. Yet something lingered unresolved, a residue of intention that no apology could erase. Later, in the corridor outside the library, the Duke encountered Eleanor unexpectedly. He paused, his expression composed but altered, as though the room had shifted. He spoke her name carefully, testing its weight. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience," he said, his tone courteous, his eyes searching. Eleanor inclined her head, accepting responsibility she had never claimed. That evening, as candles were lit and the house settled into watchful quiet, Eleanor realized that the tokens had done their work. What had begun as a gesture had become a fault line, and though she stood still, the ground beneath her had begun to move, carrying her toward a reckoning she could not yet name. The rain began without ceremony, a fine persistent veil that softened the edges of Ashcombe House and drove its inhabitants inward. By late afternoon the corridors were hushed, the carpets absorbing footsteps as though conspiring to keep secrets. Eleanor found refuge in the library, a room that asked nothing of her but attention. Firelight stirred along the spines of books, and the scent of leather and smoke steadied her breathing. She had been there scarcely a quarter hour when the door opened behind her. The sound was quiet, deliberate, as if announced to the room before reaching her ears. Eleanor did not turn at once. She knew who it would be, and knowing lent her a fleeting, fragile courage. The Duke of Ravenshollow stood just inside the threshold, his coat damp from the rain, his expression stripped of the polish he wore so easily elsewhere. He closed the door with care, not as a declaration, but as a courtesy. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, and the rain traced its patient patterns against the windows. "I hope I do not intrude," he said at last, his voice low, precise, shaped by restraint. "You do not," Eleanor replied, turning then, her tone even. She gestured to the room, an offering without invitation. "This place is accustomed to solitude." He acknowledged the remark with the faintest inclination of his head. His eyes moved over the shelves, the ladder, the narrow table where she had been reading. He seemed to be looking for something that could not be catalogued. When he spoke again, it was with an effort at formality that could not disguise its unease. "I wish to speak with you," he said, "privately, if that is agreeable." Eleanor felt the weight of the moment settle, heavy and exacting. She considered the many reasons to refuse, the dangers of proximity, the likelihood of misunderstanding. Yet she remained where she was, her hands resting lightly on the table's edge. "You may speak," she said, and meant it. He moved closer, not enough to invade, but enough to narrow the space between them into something intentional. The firelight caught the lines of his face, revealing a fatigue she had not noticed before. "There has been," he began, then paused, as though the words resisted arrangement. "There's been confusion. I regret that." Eleanor nodded once. "Confusion thrives where silence is convenient," she said quietly. The words surprised her with their firmness. He met her gaze then, fully. "You believe me careless." "I believe you careful," she replied. "Careful enough to accept what is presented, and not look beyond it." The Duke's breath left him slowly, as though he had been struck not by accusation, but by recognition. He turned toward the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture a study in control. "I have been told," he said, that discretion is a virtue, that order prevents harm. And yet harm occurs, Eleanor said, not unkindly. She moved to a chair, sitting with composed grace, refusing the role of supplicant, often in the name of preserving appearances. He turned back to her, his eyes darkened by thought. You speak as though you have long observed this. I have, she said, from the periphery. Silence followed, dense but not hostile. The rain intensified, drumming against the glass like a gathering audience. The Duke stepped closer to the table, resting his hand upon it, not touching her, but anchoring himself. I did not intend, he said, for you to be the subject of rumor or reproach. I know, Eleanor replied. Intent is a fragile defense. He almost smiled, a fleeting curve that vanished before it could settle. You are not what I expected. No one ever is, she said, her voice steady. Expectation is a form of blindness. The fire shifted, sending sparks upward, momentarily bright. The Duke watched them, then spoke with an honesty that surprised them both. When I first saw you, he said, I saw very little. That failure is mine. Eleanor felt something loosen within her chest. Not hope, but a recognition long delayed. And now, she asked. Now I see that I have mistaken silence for absence, he said. His voice lowered, waited, and dignity for indifference. She rose then, closing the distance he had respected, not to provoke, but to meet him as an equal. I have no claim upon your regard, she said, nor do I seek to disrupt what has been set in motion. I wished only to remain unmisunderstood. He looked at her as though the room had altered its shape. You deserve more than to be endured, he said softly. The words hovered between them, dangerous and unresolved. Eleanor held his gaze, her expression calm, though her heart pressed urgently against her ribs. Then we are both too late, she said, for deserving has never guided choice. Outside, the rain faltered, then ceased, leaving the world rinsed and waiting. The Duke straightened, the familiar armor returning piece by piece. I must go, he said, formality reasserting itself like a shield. He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. What I have learned here, he added, without turning, will not leave me easily. Eleanor remained by the table, the fire at her back, as the door closed and footsteps retreated. Only then did she allow herself to exhale, aware that something irrevocable had been spoken, and that whatever followed would be shaped as much by restraint as by desire, and by a choice that was even now hardening elsewhere. The announcement was made beneath crystal chandeliers, their light sharpened to brilliance for the occasion. Society gathered as if summoned by instinct, every smile rehearsed, every breath restrained. The Duke of Ravenshollow stood beside Arabella Harrington, his posture immaculate, his expression composed into certainty. When he spoke, his voice carried effortlessly, the practiced tone of a man accustomed to obedience. He declared his intention with clarity and courtesy, offering Arabella his name, his house, his future. Applause followed at once, swift and satisfied, sealing the choice as wisdom rather than fate. No one questioned the elegance of the moment aloud. Arabella accepted the attention with graceful humility, though triumph flickered unmistakably beneath her calm. She inclined her head, allowing congratulations to wash over her like perfume, intoxicating and expected. Mothers smiled approvingly. Fathers exchanged satisfied glances, and plans bloomed instantly in whispered speculation. At Arabella's side, the Duke listened politely, yet something in his gaze remained distant, as though part of him watched from elsewhere. He felt the weight of finality settle, heavy as a door closed. Appearances aligned perfectly, and perfection, he reminded himself, was rarely questioned by those who benefited most from its illusion and admired it blindly. Eleanor stood among the guests as one might stand in borrowed clothing, present yet unclaimed. She offered congratulations with measured sincerity, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. Arabella received them without meeting her eyes. The Duke inclined his head toward Eleanor, formal and restrained, as though the library's firelit truths had never been spoken. That courtesy cut deeper than dismissal. Eleanor felt the room contract around her, every polite glance a reminder of her proper place. She smiled, because dignity required no witnesses. Silence wrapped her like lace, delicate, suffocating, and publicly admired by all present there. Consequences arrived swiftly, disguised as kindness. Within days, arrangements were discussed in low voices, always stopping when Eleanor entered. A distant relation offered her a position as companion, the suggestion framed as generosity. Her mother spoke of practicality, of relief, of avoiding awkwardness. Arabella said little, her affection sharpened into formality. The house itself seemed to usher Eleanor outward, doors closing sooner, rooms growing smaller. No accusation was spoken, yet Eleanor understood she was being removed, carefully, politely, erased for harmony. Society applauded such efficiency, mistaking cruelty for order and mercy in the name of comfort, tradition, and peace always. The Duke observed these shifts with growing unease. Each polite farewell to Eleanor unsettled him more than open reproach might have done. He told himself that order required sacrifice, that choosing otherwise invited chaos. Yet memory intruded relentlessly, the quiet strength in her voice, the honesty that had unsettled his certainties. He found Arabella charming, accomplished, admired, and yet something essential failed to ignite. The future he had declared now felt rehearsed, every step predetermined. He silenced doubt with duty, believing discipline could still the heart, though its echoes grew louder with each passing hour, unrelenting, persistent, cruelly alive inside. Eleanor prepared to leave Ashcombe at dawn, her departure arranged with efficient sympathy. She packed without ceremony, selecting only what was hers by memory rather than value. Letters arrived wishing her well, each one confirming her expendability. That night, she walked the gardens alone, the air cool, the paths familiar. She felt grief, but also relief, as though the house had long been too narrow for her becoming. If she was to vanish, she would do so intact, carrying no bitterness, only clarity learned through years of quiet endurance, careful observation, and uncelebrated survival, finally complete, holy, haze alone now. The Duke did not see her before she left. Obligation kept him elsewhere, smiling through congratulations that felt increasingly hollow. When informed of Eleanor's departure, he acknowledged it with composure that bordered on coldness. Yet later, alone, he paused in the corridor outside the library. The room seemed altered without her presence, its silence accusatory. He realized then that choice, once announced, did not absolve consequence. It merely delayed it, allowing regret to mature unseen, unchallenged, and increasingly impossible to ignore. Despite rank, approval, celebration, and collective relief surrounding him always like a shadow lengthening toward him silently, inevitably now. Arabella sensed the change before it was named. The Duke's attentions grew precise rather than warm, his courtesy flawless yet distant. She told herself this was the nature of settled arrangements, that passion yielded to stability. Still, resentment stirred, sharp and unacknowledged. She thought of Eleanor, of her quiet gaze, and felt an irritation she refused to examine. Victory should not feel so precarious. She clung to admiration, determined not to lose what had been so elegantly secured through performance, approval, and careful adherence to expectation, tradition, and her own ambition, guarded fiercely, anxiously, daily, without pause, question, or mercy. News of the impending marriage spread beyond Ashcombe, carrying with it a version of events polished into inevitability. Eleanor's absence was noted briefly, then dismissed. She traveled onward, her future undefined, yet strangely lightened. Distance granted perspective, and with it, strength. She did not imagine the Duke would follow, nor that her name would linger. She believed the chapter closed, its lessons absorbed. Yet fate, patient and exacting, rarely concludes a story at the moment chosen by pride alone, especially when truth has been acknowledged, resisted, and deliberately set aside by powerful hands, hearts, and histories, unresolved, waiting, watchful, still. On the night the engagement was celebrated, the Duke stood at his window, listening to distant music fade. He thought of firelight, rain, and a voice that had spoken without demand. Below, the world prepared to congratulate him again. He straightened, resolved to proceed. Yet as he turned away, he felt the certainty he had chosen crack, just enough to let in doubt. Somewhere beyond the house, Eleanor stepped into her future, unaware that his greatest consequence had already begun quietly, invisibly, shaped by restraint, regret, and a love recognized too late, yet impossible to forget, alter, escape, or undo. Time altered the world with an unremarkable patience, wearing down sharp edges and gilding others with false comfort. The Duke of Ravenshollow married as expected, beneath vaulted ceilings and approving eyes, the ceremony flawless in execution. Arabella became a duchess amid applause that mistook elegance for triumph. The estate flourished, dinners were attended, heirs anticipated, and society declared the choice vindicated. Yet beneath the surface of ordered days, something essential remained unresolved, like a melody begun in the wrong key and never corrected. Marriage revealed itself not as a union, but as an arrangement maintained by effort. Arabella performed her role with exacting diligence, her charm sharpened into strategy, her smiles deployed with purpose. The Duke responded with courtesy and distance, their conversations efficient, their silences crowded. He fulfilled his obligations with care, yet found no rest in them. Each night he lay awake listening to the house settle, aware of a persistent absence that could not be named without consequence. Memory returned unbidden, not as longing alone, but as judgment. Eleanor's life unfolded elsewhere, quieter and true for its lack of spectators. She accepted a position as governess to the daughter of a provincial family, her days structured by learning and responsibility. Distance refined her grief into something like clarity. She read, taught, and walked the countryside with a growing sense of self-possession. Those who met her noted her calm intelligence, her steady presence. She did not speak of Ashcombe, nor of the Duke, yet his influence lingered like a shadow at the edge of thought, softened by time but never fully erased. Years passed. News traveled selectively, carrying fragments of the Duke's discontent to places it did not belong. His marriage remained intact, yet strained by unspoken resentments. Arabella sensed his withdrawal and resented it fiercely, clinging to appearances as proof of victory. When whispers reached her of Eleanor's continued existence, they struck like an insult. She dismissed them aloud, but privately feared the endurance of what she had sought to eclipse. Beauty faded subtly, admiration required greater effort, and control tightened into something brittle. The reckoning came quietly, as such things often do. Arabella fell ill during the winter, her health failing with a swiftness that shocked society into sympathy. The Duke attended her with the attentiveness expected of him, yet grief revealed itself less as devastation than as exhaustion. When she died, mourned sincerely and publicly, he felt sorrow without devastation, relief without triumph. The house entered mourning, and he entered a solitude that felt less like loss than release from a performance long sustained. In the months that followed, he withdrew from society, attending only to necessity. It was during this retreat that a letter reached him, forwarded from an old acquaintance. It was written in Eleanor's hand, precise and composed, informing him of her intention to leave England for good. A position awaited her abroad, one that promised independence and purpose. She wrote not to seek permission or closure, but out of courtesy, acknowledging a chapter concluded. Her words were measured, kind, and utterly devoid of expectation. The letter undid him. He read it once, then again, each sentence a mirror reflecting his failure with merciless clarity. The realization struck not as sudden revelation, but as confirmation of what he had long resisted. Love, he understood at last, was not the grand gesture sanctioned by approval, but the quiet recognition of another's truth. He had seen it, named it, and turned away. The consequence was not punishment imposed from without, but a life lived beside regret, intimate and unrelenting. Against every instinct of restraint that had governed him, the Duke acted. He ordered a carriage and rode through the night, driven not by hope of forgiveness, but by the necessity of honesty. He found Eleanor at the edge of departure, her belongings modestly arranged, her composure intact. She received him with surprise, not warmth, her dignity unaltered by his presence. For a moment, neither spoke, the past pressing close between them. "I have come too late," he said, and the admission cost him more than any declaration had ever done. "You have come truthfully," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "That is not nothing." He did not beg. He did not offer rescue or recompense. He spoke instead of recognition, of the choices he had made, and the cost of mistaking approval for wisdom. He acknowledged her worth without claiming it, her influence without demanding return. The words were simple, stripped of ceremony, and for the first time, he did not shield himself behind duty. Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable. She felt the weight of years settle and lift simultaneously. "What you offer now," she said at last, "is not love as I once imagined it. It is respect, earned too late to alter the past." "I know," he said. "I ask for nothing that is not freely given." Silence followed, not heavy, but contemplative. Eleanor looked beyond him, toward the road that would carry her away. She had built a life from fragments, learned strength without reliance. The choice before her was not between him and independence, but between bitterness and grace. She turned back to him, her eyes clay. "Then hear this," she said. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I do not wish to carry what you have left behind." The absolution struck deeper than reproach. He bowed his head, acknowledging the gift without attempting to claim more. When he looked up, she was already turning away, her future intact, her path chosen. He watched her depart, knowing the story had reached its true end not in union, but in understanding. Years later, the Duke would be remembered as a man changed by loss, his generosity quiet, his counsels sought for its humility. Eleanor would be remembered by those she taught as a woman of rare steadiness, her influence lasting and unseen. Their lives did not converge again, yet each carried the mark of the other, indelible and instructive. In the end, society forgot the details, as it always does. But somewhere between what was chosen and what was lost, a truth endured, that the cost of choosing wrongly is not borne by the moment, but by the years that follow, and that love, once recognized, alters the soul forever, even when it arrives too late to be claimed.